Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this panel on character, community, and capital. And I can't think of anyone who exemplifies all three but Wes. I mean, you're a tri-sector person, meaning he's worked in private sector, in government, in the public sector. Yeah. He's been, well, we've really got to start. One of his starts, I think, is an author. I'm only showing two of his books. He didn't know I was going to plug these, but the author of the other Wes Moore and The Work, which...
My publisher appreciates that very much.
But he's also been a White House staffer, as you heard, a combat officer, a decorated combat officer, a Rhodes Fellow, a Wall Street executive. I mean, and again, now with the author, I guess that's a quad sector. So McKinsey's going to have to adapt its language. But anyway... Welcome, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Melanie. It's a joy being with you. Hi, everybody. I'm incredibly excited to be here and frankly, pretty humbled because I've had a chance to learn a lot about not just what's taking place today, but I've had a chance to learn a lot about who I'm sitting in front of. You all are not just remarkably accomplished in terms of what you've done already, but there's a significant amount of promise about what you're expected to do next. So it's a joy to be in your presence. It's a joy to be here with you, and I'm just thrilled to have this conversation, so thank you.
Thank you. And I think you're going to find this session really deep and inspiring. And we're going to start out by, first I'll just touch on Robinhood, but then I want to take a path to Wes's personal background and then kind of explode it out to the larger impact that we all can make at large and the sector. Wes, Robinhood Foundation is, well, one of the largest foundations in the United States that's anti-poverty. It's, I believe, ranked around 80th on the largest foundations in the United States at about roughly $185 million. That's massive. Could you just give us a 30-second on what does Robinhood Foundation do before I trailer back into your personal story?
Absolutely. So the Robinhood Foundation is 31 years old, and at first I'm excited and humbled that one of our board members, Cecily Carson, is here. So Cecily, thank you so much for being here. As she dives into the chair. But the Robinhood Foundation is 31 years old and has an exclusive focus on fighting poverty in New York City, where Robinhood first started 31 years ago. Basically looking at the idea that, that we were going to have a really challenging time in the financial markets, the group of founders led by Paul Tudor Jones, who were looking and saying, we think this is going to be a complicated time in the markets. This was 1988. But when they collectively got together, they said, but you know who this is really going to be hard on? People living in poverty. Because everybody knows that the first people that gets hit when things go down, the first places that people look to cut, the first people that are always going to take the significant impact are people who already have the least. And so they created this foundation called Robinhood, where initially Robinhood started off with making $40,000 worth of grants, and $40,000 supporting 3 different organizations. Now, 31 years later, Robinhood has given out north of $3 billion into the poverty fight, again, exclusively focusing on this idea of poverty in New York City. And I think one of the powerful things about Robinhood, so Robinhood was really one of the first organizations that really said, we want to drill down and hone in on using data to be able to focus on this work. And that was important because I think the founding partners of Robinhood looked at it and said, we use data to make every decision that we do when it comes to our businesses. So why should it be any different when it comes to our philanthropic investments? Where we use information and where, we won't look at a company and simply say, wow, the picture on the prospectus on that company looked really good. Maybe I'll invest, right? You actually have to look at the company, know the leadership, know the data behind it. And so the same type of philosophy was put to the organizations that Robinhood supports. And the second thing is that when we look at the work that Robinhood does, the data matters because it helps to shape the way we focus on how we do our work. And a perfect example is actually a partnership that we have with Columbia University. So with Columbia, we have a partnership called the Poverty Tracker. And what the Poverty Tracker is we work with Columbia University researchers to look at a longitudinal data set of around 4,000 New Yorkers. And really, you're able to look at real-time assessments as to where people are. And that really helps us to give us a gauge as to how are we doing when it comes to the poverty fight. There was a fascinating stat that came out of some of the work that we've done with Columbia University right here, is that when you look at poverty in this city, it's not just that it exists, it's that it's amazingly sticky. It's not just the fact that we're talking half of New Yorkers, almost half of New Yorkers, and think about this, have experienced poverty over the past 5 years, or past 3 years, apologize. Almost half, not in a borough, not in a group, almost half of the city. When we're talking about people who have been in poverty, who have left poverty, over 30% of them will be back in poverty within a year. Because singular shocks are enough to knock a person back down into poverty. And the reality is that here in this city, over 40% of people could not afford an emergency $400 bill. Poverty is real, and it's surrounding us. And so the work that Robin Hood really does is trying to attack poverty everywhere that we see it, in every way that we can. Utilizing every tool, utilizing every measure, because we know that this is not something that is an ephemeral problem. But we also know that our ability to be able to put not just resources and energy and time and focus and advocacy behind these issues, that if we choose to, we can actually do something about it. And so for the past 3 decades, that's been the focus of the organization. And for the past 3 years, I've been honored to be its CEO.
Wes, that's amazing. And I know that you know poverty because you lived it when you were growing up in Baltimore. I know you lost your father at a very young age. And then you ended up, because of that, moving to the Bronx to live with your grandparents. Can you speak to a time as you were growing up in the Bronx that if there were one moment or 2 moments that really shifted the way that you look at the world today, and in particular leadership?
It is interesting, and it's not lost on me. I remember when I was actually working on Wall Street, and I could take the 2 train down to my office down on Wall Street, and I could actually take the 2 train directly back up to where I grew up in the Bronx. Straight shot. And I remember once having a conversation with my grandmother, and this is when my grandfather was still around. And I came home, and I went to go see them, and they had cooked up all these Caribbean food and pig's feet and jerk chicken. For most people, that sounds nasty, but it is so delicious. If you put hot sauce on them, it's delicious.
It's the Jamaican influence coming out.
Yes. And I went to go see them, and I remember, and I was working as a banker at that time. And I remember my grandfather asked me as I was sitting there eating the food, he asked me, he said, "So what exactly do you do?" And I had no idea how to answer that question. And I remember my grandmother, she came and she saved me. Because she's like, "Dear, you know he's a banker?" And she said to me, and she said at that point, she said, "In fact, I'm gonna ask Ms. Johnson to go deposit her checks with you." My grandmother thought I was a bank teller. My grandmother didn't know that if Ms. Johnson handed me her Social Security check, I would have no idea what to do with it. My grandmother didn't know that if Ms. Johnson came down to my office, Ms. Johnson was our neighbor, that if Ms. Johnson came down to my office on Wall Street to come see me, she couldn't make it past security. And so this dynamic of where I was in this existence and where I'd come from was still so stark. And I even got this constant reminder, even from my own family, where I couldn't even articulate exactly where I was sitting because I didn't know how to articulate it. Go ahead, please. Well, you know, but I think what was really, and so you talk about kind of a singular moment. we lived in a community, and ironically, the community that we came up in was actually one of the first communities that Robin Hood invested in. And so in some ways, I feel like my experience now coming to Robin Hood is in some ways a very full circle experience for me, because I feel like this was an organization who saw me before I even knew what it was. And that actually means something to me. But I think about the fact that I was in a community that was chronically neglected, and we knew it. We say everything that we need to say to our children about what we expect from them and what we expect to see of them without saying a word to them. By just looking at the air that we ask them to breathe and the water that we ask them to drink, the communities we ask them to live in, the homes that we ask them to exist in, the schools that we ask them to attend. We're saying everything we need to say to our kids about what we expect of them without saying a word. And so I think about this work, and I think about some of the lessons that I take from it and that I take from my personal experience is what I needed was not for anybody to come in and save me. I didn't need to be saved by anybody. What I needed was for people to hear me, to see me as a peer, see me as an equal. And what I needed for people to do was to be deliberate about removing the barriers that they were deliberate about putting in front of me. That we can't act like the neighborhoods and the existence that we have and the structures that we have in place, we can't act like that happened by accident. It didn't. The challenges we're asking our communities to face, it's not like we woke up one morning and say, man, that's crazy. How did it get like that? We know how it got like that because we created it. And so the lesson that I tried to take from my upbringing and from my growth and the way we have to think about the work, all of us collectively, is if you are not doing your work, not in the community, but with the community, if you're not doing your work, not with the community at the table, but with the community, and not the community with a voice, but with the community with a vote, if you're not doing your work in full partnership in every single way, then your work and your altruism will be perceived as something else. And that actually ends up compounding the larger problem.
Wes, there's a lot of stuff to unpack in there. Really, this is fantastic. So back to the upbringing, and I'm going to talk about leadership now. If you could pick one quality from your upbringing, your years in the Bronx, what was the one quality that you were instilled, whether it be from your community, your parents? What was that one quality that defined who you are today and how you express it in your leadership?
Good question.
Oh, I'm full of them.
You are full of good questions. I think there's a dance with patience that I think leaders have to be able to understand. My mother used to tell me something that I thought was actually really interesting, and I didn't understand it when she said it, but I feel like it's interesting as you get older how much smarter your parents become. And she used to say something that, again, honestly, I didn't really get it before, but she said, wisdom is understanding when patience is a virtue and when patience is a detriment. And being able to distinguish between those two. And again, I didn't get it, but I feel like I do now. Because I think that tempo and pace is something as a leader that you're constantly grappling with and wrestling with. How fast to move on certain things, whether on certain things you need to slow down, being able to adjust depending on what the environment is giving you, which things you need to prioritize, which things you need to set back, which things you need to kind of keep cool, but then as soon as the moment's ready, it's got to be ready to pounce because you know that window's gonna close very quickly. A lot of that stuff is just a dance, and a lot of it's just it's about timing and prioritization. And so you can have the clearest set of goals as to what my North Star is. Here's what I'm trying to accomplish. But if you don't get prioritization and timing right, it all falls apart. So you've got to make sure you understand when patience is a virtue and when patience is a detriment. And be okay with both. Because there will be certain things that you feel like this is just moving far too slow, but there's a reason that you have to pace it out the way that it's pacing out. And there's a reason why you have to say it sometimes. The answer is go. Right now, the answer is go. And you know the reason is because that runway to be able to get that thing done, which is crucial to everything else getting done, is short. And so I think that was one of the lessons that I think I have a much better appreciation for, of being able to understand when patience sits in which bucket.
So when was the time where you got your leadership so wrong? Where you were so impatient that you pulled the trigger too quickly?
Oh, I do it all the time. I'm an impatient personality, right? And you know, I think one thing that I think is interesting that, so I look at it this way. I feel like when you go into an organization or you're building an organization, you have to think about that organization like clay. Where when you're first there, clay is very soft and clay is very malleable, right? And that's a good thing, because when clay is malleable, you can play with it, you can make a shape, you can say, I don't like that shape, you can turn it back into a ball, you can turn it into a new shape, you can do all that kind of stuff when clay is soft. When clay is soft, you can change something and it's fine. Once clay hardens, the only way you can change its shape is to break it. And so you want to do as much movement and flexible pieces while clay is still soft. And I think about it this way, where, you know, and whether it's Robinhood or other organizations I've been in, you don't have to be in a rush to make a bunch of decisions when you first start off. You're going to feel that way. You're going to start off a new job, you're going to start a new responsibility, you're going to take over a company, you're going to do whatever, and you're going to feel this pressure. I've got to make change now. I've got a mandate to make change. I've got to do all this kind of stuff. All that, and you might feel it, you might say it, but I'm telling you right now, there is nobody putting pressure on you to make fast change more than you. The key thing that you want to do is spend time. Listen, hear, play with the clay. Because some of the worst decisions that I have made in situations like that were some of the firsts. Because you made them quick. You made them without context. You made them without an understanding. You made them because you thought that this was just the thing you had to do because you had to make change, you had to change this, you had to change that. And then you end up spending time and energy and breaking clay, undoing decisions that you made. So the key thing is, I think when you first get to a place, I think you want to spend time and listen. Hear. Do not make too many decisions when you first start, because you don't have to. No one's putting pressure on you. And in fact, I'd say in the first year or so, in the first year of a time in an organization, the fewer hardcore, long-term, structural decisions that you have to make, the better. Because those are always the decisions that, in most cases, that you'll have to go back and reevaluate or rethink or reconsider later on.
Great advice, Wes. So in your book, The Work, another plug, right?
Thank you.
You're really talking about people finding their purpose through their work. Let me turn this on you. What would you say is your life's purpose?
I would say that my life's purpose is I feel like so many of the distinct conditions that so many of our children are born into, decisions that are made on their behalf before they even have a choice. I feel like my life's work is to make sure that choice and options for people are actually real. That where people end up and what people choose to do and what happens in people's existence, that should be on them and not on anybody else. But I feel like the society and the structures that we have right now are ones where we have people who we are deciding where they end up. We are deciding whether or not they don't just are born into poverty, but will die there. We're making that decision for people. And so I feel like my life's work is the ability to use every tool that I feel like I've been blessed to be able to use, whether it's a tool of philanthropy, whether it's a tool of storytelling, whether it's a tool of media, whether it's a tool of advocacy, whether it's a tool of just being annoying as hell to lawmakers. Every tool that we have, I feel like it is about achieving fairness and justice. Fairness and justice so that all people actually have a say in their destiny, and so that their destiny doesn't have to be something that's pre-written or something that other people are deciding for them.
What do you think, in that same vein, is the greatest lever that can be pulled to really narrow the divide of those inequalities?
Yes.
To have this
Yes.
this vision.
All of it.
All of them.
All of them.
Is there one that you believe is most significant, that's
Nope.
going to make the greatest impact?
Because I feel like all of them need each other.
Mm.
I feel like so if you think about it, right? I think when we think about some of the systems that we have in place right now, and people talk about things like, well, what becomes the most effective branch of government, for example, right? You know, is it the legislative? Is it the executive? Is it the judicial? The answer is yes. And none of them can be left off the hook in actually taking hold of what is their personal measure of accountability. And I think the same thing about the tools that we have, where I look at an organization like Robin Hood, right? Where Robin Hood every year, we will fund and support hovering around 260 organizations within the city of New York. And we fund organizations that focus on everything ranging from schools to shelters, to mental and physical health, to housing. And there is no one tool or vehicle that is going to be more important than the other. So you look at our grant making, we can find and we can fund and we can build the best organizations within New York City and put real resources behind them. But here's the reality. Every single one of those organizations exists because there is a structural or fundamental breakdown that requires them, that makes them necessary. You know, there's a quote that actually sits on my desk from Dr. King, and it says, philanthropy is commendable, but the philanthropists can never forget the economic injustice that makes philanthropy necessary. And so we will use our grant-making tools because we think it's an extraordinarily effective way of being able to support organizations who are on the ground doing the good work. But we also know we will have to use advocacy, and we will have to focus on policies, because there are policies that are currently in place that are putting people and keeping people in poverty. And so using policy and using advocacy to be able to better prep the battlefield so that the grant-making organizations can do their work is imperative. And we also know that narrative matters. Who's in poverty and why? Because the conversation about who's in poverty and why right now does not honestly reflect the reality. The truth is when we're talking about people who are living in poverty, when we're talking about people who are, the majority of people who are going to spend the night in shelters tonight, which, by the way, hovers around 60,000 people who will stay in shelters tonight just in this city. 23,000 of them are children who will stay in shelters tonight. The reality is when we're talking about the population we're talking about, you know who we're talking about, statistically, anecdotally? It's the working poor. It's people who have jobs, in some cases, multiple jobs, and still living below the poverty line. And so how do we make sure that the narrative actually properly reflects the work we're trying to get done? You know, if you look at every piece of good policy or bad policy that's ever been passed in our nation, the reality is this: it first started with a narrative change. It first started with the way that we changed the way we talked about it. Every piece of good policy or bad policy. So, you know, a policy came, people told us to be afraid of something, and we passed a policy that protected us from it. Or people told us to live up to our better angels, and we passed a policy that allowed us to do that. And so all those mechanisms become important if we're actually going to accomplish our work. And so I think we have to put the proper amount of weight on all of them.
And let's talk about Robinhood, what Robinhood specifically is doing this. I know you have about 200 NGOs that you're supporting.
Yep.
And are they in particular, what issue areas are they particularly focused on? And how are they changing the system?
Yeah. It's so we have the largest individual portfolio item that we have within Robinhood is our education portfolio. That represents around 32% of all of our grants. And when I say education, that represents everything from early childhood education, healthy birth, healthy school starts, et cetera, all the way up to K-12, all the way up to transitions into higher education, all the way up to job retraining and job reskilling. So all of those things kind of focus on our education portfolio in some way, shape, or form. But our portfolio is vast. And the way we actually look at our portfolios, we basically say, if it touches poverty, we will find it and fund it and actually work to build it. But the interesting thing I think about our portfolio is actually this, and this is actually something I think is very relevant to where you all are and what you all are doing. We're very clear that our job at Robinhood is our capital is patient, but our capital should not be permanent, right? Our capital and our job is not to be a line item in an organization. Our job is to actually ask the fundamental question, what is it that you are trying to accomplish? And then how do we help you get there? That our job isn't necessarily to be a safety net, that the job is to be the springboard. And so by thinking about our capital in that way, it becomes important that we say organizationally, our job isn't to start something, our job is to end something. What's the problem that you are trying to end? And then what supports do you need in order to actually end it? And in some cases, it's about how do you take what's working at an organization and fund it and then help it to scale. In some cases, it's about how do we change a policy? And so it's about supporting organization, but at the same time, simultaneously, making sure we're attacking the policy that makes the work that that organization is doing necessary. In some cases, it's about finding something that's working, but knowing that that work and the necessity exist outside of a borough or outside of a city, and making sure that we can take that thing that's working and actually scale it to other jurisdictions. And so we really try to attack the work and think about our work that way, where our goal is to end things. And so everything that we will fund, everything that we will think about, that has that as our primary goal, and the ability to do it with a completely community-minded focus.
That's great, Wes. And we're going to transition to the audience for questions. I'll ask you one question while people can come up to the microphones if they have questions for Wes. Wes, of the most successful organizations that you've been funding at Robinhood, what would you say are the one or two characteristics that the leadership of the greatest leaders possess in those organizations?
That's a great question. I would say there's a few different elements that we look for. First of all, the leader and the leaders matter to us deeply. And it's the same thing in investing in a company where, you'll find people that the leader sometimes is enough to get organizations to say, even if that model isn't fully baked out from that person, I so believe in that person and that they're gonna have the right team around them and they're gonna figure it out, that I'm willing to make the investment because I'm willing to make a bet on them.
And what quality are you looking for or that you've determined has been the most greatest indicator of success?
Yeah, I think so. So first, we need to see a clear sense of passion and a commitment on the issue. Do they really believe? And are they committed to actually figuring it out? Do they have the prerequisite either skill set or do they have the prerequisite team that's going to be necessary? Have they done their homework about not just the space, but the lane, and what is the individual value add that product, that platform, that organization can actually add to this conversation that's going to actually make a dent and make an impact? And I think, are they already thinking deeply about the role that they can uniquely play and what an exit then strategy looks like? Because to be very honest, an organization who comes and says, well, we do X, and if the question to them becomes, so what does this problem look like in 5 years? Or what does your organization look like in 5 years? And if they tell us, well, our organization has grown by X, that's fine. But actually, when I ask that question, it's really more about what dent has your organization had on the problem?
Again, back to your impact metrics.
It's the impact metrics. It's not interesting to say, well, I believe the organization is going to grow by 13%. I'm not investing in a television company. I'm investing in something that's trying to change the world. I'm investing in something that's trying to actually target a human pain. If I'm asking you about solving a human pain, I don't care about how big you see your organization getting in 5 years. I want you to talk to me about how small the problem will be in 5 years because of your work and because of your efforts. That's a much more interesting question to me.
Yeah, totally. Please.
Hi, my name is Janet Genser. I'm with Nonprofit Finance Fund. My question is, how do you define social justice, and how do you define social justice organizations?
Good question. Brian Stevenson has a quote, which I think is just it's a brilliant quote and encapsulates it well, where he says, the opposite of poverty is not wealth. The opposite of poverty is justice. And so when we think about our work as a poverty-fighting organization, what we are really trying to achieve is justice. A justice that a person can exist and know that they can have dreams and their dreams won't be laughed at. A justice to know that a child can be born and that child has just as much promise to achieve its God-given hopes as any other child that's born anywhere else. A justice to know that we are going to be diligent and unapologetic about removing barriers that consistently stand in the way of people and that continue to serve as off-ramps onto hope and opportunity. You know, we look at a metric of being able to understand how do we look to sustainably lift families out of poverty, measurably and sustainably, is really our North Star and our goal as an organization. And we know that when you're looking at not just the data around it, but the qualitative examples, that we are continuing to tell a lie to people about their prospects here. Where we tell people that, you know, this American dream or this American idea is that, you know, if you just work hard enough. The truth is we have people who are working really hard. And we still have systems and structures that are continuing to tell them that it's just not true. And so when we talk about justice, justice for us is a removal of these barriers and a removal of these obstacles that can actually help people to achieve what it is that as I believe, is the God-given destiny of every child who enters into this planet.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Wes and Melanie. It's a great discussion. My name is Lee Wack. I do development for Chalkbeat, which is focused on education journalism here in New York and several other cities, and we're expanding.
You guys do good work.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Our CEO, Elizabeth Green, is fantastic. And, you know, I just joined the team recently. But given what you're doing in education, you've talked a lot about that even this afternoon. But given what you're doing as far as with new schools here in New York, I just wanted to hear more from you about that. Why you took on that initiative and the different types of impacts you're looking to make.
Yeah, thank you very much. And so we're proud that we just launched an initiative that's looking to initiate upwards of tens of thousands of new high quality seats for kids in New York City, in public schools of all forms, district schools, charter schools, et cetera, with also lessons learned that can then be shared and scaled. Here's the reality, is about 250,000 kids that are in New York City schools are attending schools that, again, these are not our numbers, these are DOE numbers, that are deemed to be failing seats. So i.e., even if the kid were to finish, that student is not college or career ready. That we have 1/5 of all kids in New York City that are not reading at grade level. And this goes back to what we're talking about when it comes to justice. Where we have a constitutional requirement and we have a constitutional commitment to be able to educate all children. Now, educating all children doesn't just mean putting them in a school. educating all children means that we're actually putting them in places that are going to make them either college or career ready at the completion of their primary school process. And right now, we do not do that as a city. And so this one initiative that we just announced, and again, Robin Hood has been involved in education platforms of supporting public school students in all forms of public schools for really since our earliest days. But this one new initiative that we're building right now is actually working in partnership with the Department of Education and saying we want to go through the process of looking at building out upwards of 10 district schools, upwards of 18 charter schools, increasing the number of high quality seats, again, upwards of tens of thousands or 20,000 seats that'll be achieved. But more importantly, being able to take the lessons learned from the top performing schools, from the top performing areas, and being able to take those and scale those lessons learned into the way we think about education. Because the truth is, when it comes to education, primary education, K-12 education, elementary education, higher education, we know what works. We know what the challenges are. So the question then becomes, it really goes back to a larger question of both political will to be able to make sure that those assets and to make sure that those lessons learned are being shared and are being exposed to all students who are in our public schools. And how do we think about it when it comes to basic elements of things like, making sure that we are not going to cherry pick our winners and our losers? Making sure that we can have conversations about, conversations and making sure that we are making the idea of backfilling mandatory. Making sure that we're having conversations about being able to put high talent, high quality principals in every school, high talent, high quality teachers in every classroom. Making sure we're thinking about it holistically when it comes to our students, that it's not just about what happens inside of the classroom, but if you're also not completely focusing on making sure that that child has full wraparound supports that also incorporates the family members, that we're not doing our job. And so one of the things I think we're excited about is in partnership with the DOE, is by really working with the New York City Department of Education to say, if we know what works and we know the role that philanthropy and the DOE can play in partnership, and again, not just Robin Hood, but other philanthropies, then why would we not make this our primary goal? And so we're excited that, again, not just with the history that Robin Hood has had in this space, but in the history with this partnership as well. We're not just thrilled, but we're hopeful because we think this is an important model for not just New York City, but beyond, when it comes to how do we work in partnership to create real platforms of opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. So Wes, congratulations. I remember listening to you on the Chris Hayes show many, many years ago, way before you were CEO of Robin Hood and you've written your books. And
when I was running my mouth to Chris.
Yes, so it's wonderful to see you and someone like Darren Walker, who's the head of Ford Foundation.
Yes.
People who have the skills, smart, also have lived the experience of what it is like to live in poverty. So the question I have for you is, Robin Hood is incredible. It's obviously given out a lot of money. It's well known. But what do you say to the comments that have often been made that it's too metrics focused and there are certain things that cannot be quantifiable? And the impression is that hedge fund managers have taken over philanthropy, and that's, sort of influencing the way other foundations operate. And there are certain services that have to be provided that's, incredibly important and can never come to there are many nonprofits who feel there will always be a need. You never can get to the point where all nonprofits can close down because there is no need in New York City.
Yeah, great question. Tell me your name again, I'm sorry.
Yankee Shering, and I manage a CDFI that provides access to credit for micro and small business owners. We work primarily with immigrants, refugees, and women.
Beautiful. Yankee Shering, thank you so much for your work and for that question too. I oftentimes think about this metric question, and I wrestle with it. And I wrestle with it for this reason. One, because when we talk about how do we think about our metrics, and interesting because Robin Hood actually is very much going through a process about thinking about the metrics and basically the idea of how do you layer on this concept of mobility, because as an organization, we've continued to push ourselves to think about the idea of economic mobility as a goal, that it's not just poverty alleviation. Because one thing we know and believe as an organization is our job is not to make poverty more tolerable. Our job is not to make poverty easier on people. Our job is to actually move people out of it and to make poverty history. And so it's adding on that metric of an economic mobility lens to the way we think about metrics. But the reason I bring that up also is because oftentimes when people say, well, not everything can be measured, I think I understand the point. But also I believe to my core this: anything that matters, we find ways to measure in our society. We find ways to put quantitative understandings behind different things. It's interesting, though, that when it comes to justice issues, when it comes to issues of supporting and fighting with and believing in our most vulnerable, that's where people think metrics can and should become either less important or diluted. But the things that, frankly, that have zero relevance or less importance when it comes to the fight for social justice, everyone thinks, but you can put a measurement on that. I think we have to be able to be hard and diligent and honest about if something is going to matter to us, if something's going to matter to our society, we have to be able to know how we're doing. How are we getting there? Are we getting better? Not everything is a good try. We in philanthropy, we're not in the arbitrage business. We're not in a business that we get to win just because we write checks. No, we don't get to win just because we write checks. We get to win when the problem gets smaller. We get to win when we've made the problem gone. And so I think with that, if that's the demand, if that's the push that I have as a leader, that we have as an organization, then I think we have to be very clear about, we have to put core metrics on the things that we are, not just the things that we are funding, but what is the goal we are trying to achieve in this work. And so, I think about it where, and again, it goes back to what exactly are we, what exactly are we measuring? Where we need to know whether or not an investment is actually achieving what it is that we hope to achieve. We can't just simply be okay with the fact that, it sounds good.
Okay.
And
thank you.
so I'll just kind of put a point on that as well, where and I think about this organizationally, and this is a very real and personal thing, where if the question is how much money has the organization given away and that type of thing, it's like you could put that to we could give you an exact dollar amount over a 10 period of time, 5-year period. But if you change the question and said, how many people have been sustainably moved out of poverty? We can't give you an answer. That's a problem. We've got to be able to measure that. And it means we've got to be able to use a multitude of tools to be able to do it. Part of the reason that we have our build out when it comes to policy, and part of the reason we have our build out when it comes to partnerships is, all folks who say that philanthropy alone is not going to do it, my answer is, I agree. We're not going to philanthropy our way out of this because we are dealing with structural inequities. And so philanthropy's job is not just to write checks, no matter how much data is behind them. Philanthropy's job is to use every tool at our disposal to be able to address, call out, attack, advocate, push for, celebrate when the right things happen, and call out when the wrong things happen. But to make sure that every single asset in our toolkit is then used to be able to achieve a level of economic justice that we demand.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. Excuse me. Hello, my name is Sean Shokombi, and I actually run a consulting firm that is focused on the African continent, so developing entrepreneurs there. But I'm also interested in bringing more of the diaspora community from here abroad
Amen.
to do this work. And my question for you is that you're alluding to a lot of what you're alluding to has to do with the industrial complex. So there's a wider systemic issue that benefits off of us continuing to stay in the position of needing support or needing help and being vulnerable, right? And my question to you is, you're asking the right questions of people who are seeking funding from your foundation in terms of like, how are you going to make sure this problem is actually alleviated or disappears? How do we get other people who are not asking that question or frankly not interested in asking that question because again, they have a vested interest in us continuing to be in a supplicated, position? Is it a matter of you as a leader in this philanthropic world to say like, this needs to stop on a wider scale, or does it need to be a grassroots movement from us who are the vulnerables in this position? And then how do we like leverage enough power to say like, we are not going to continue to be manipulated or exploited for the benefit of others?
Y'all ask such good questions, man. No, that's real. So my answer is, I think we all have a collective responsibility to be able to do that and use that. I think about so first I'll say from the perspective of the foundation. I think oftentimes, and we were talking a little bit backstage, where I think ESG and CSR is awesome. It's great. It's fantastic, right? And I think corporations who get involved in ESG and CSR work, I think is wonderful. I think if they're doing it because it looks good on their annual report, or it looks good because you're doing it as a PR tool, I would really question why. It's not just the why we're doing it, but I think it behooves all of us from the world of philanthropy, from the world of business, to actually put real heft and weight behind that. I applaud the work of the Business Roundtable and the decision, the statement that the Business Roundtable made. I'm extraordinarily anxious to see the weight and the heft and the teeth behind that, because I know that our collective industries have the ability to move these issues if we so choose. And so I think it does. I think so. So part of my responsibility as a leader in philanthropy is both to lead by example, both in the way that we think about our organization, and so people can hold up our organization, and I could sit there and say and defend that when people say, well, all philanthropy does is write checks, I can sit there and say with a very straight face, not us. We have the receipts to prove that we do more than just write checks. And we're very clear about our ability to be able to keep doing that. I also know that it does become my responsibility to make sure that all of our other philanthropic partners, some of whom were mentioned earlier today, that we have a chance and have an opportunity, a unique opportunity right now, to move as a larger force that can actually make the role of philanthropy less necessary, as Dr. King talked about. Now, I do think that when we're talking about social organizations and individuals who are fighting and working on the cause, I think there's also a collective responsibility there too. Because I think both as the organizations who are doing the work, our job is to make sure that we are filling in and plugging in a hole where we see a hole. Our job is also to make sure that that we are doing our own proper diligence, to be able to make sure that we're not just creating another organization that does what 15 other organizations do. As a prime example, there are 2,300 VSOs in this country right now. VSOs are veteran serving organizations. And I'm a veteran, and I know many of them. And I say this with all love and respect because I'm very involved in a collection of different veterans issues. There are not 2,300 veterans issues. There's not 2,300 issues that veterans are dealing with, but there are 2,300 organizations that work on them. We have a lot of organizations that are doing the same things or other organizations do. What ends up happening is you end up diluting not just capital, but then it ends up becoming a larger dilution of a narrative. And so what ends up happening is the strongest organizations don't get the supports that they need. And so the two things that I would ask all social entrepreneurs to do is, one, make sure we're really doing diligence on who's doing what. Do not be afraid to partner. Do not be afraid to work with other organizations. We don't need everyone, be focused on ending something, not starting something. And the same thing that I would say, and I would ask for all the social entrepreneurs as well, is do not be afraid to go after and attack not just the end result, but the reason for the end result. That for every single organization that we're talking about, it's not just that your work is necessary. Attack the reason that it's necessary. Attack those systems, attack those structures, attack those laws. Because that gives us the opportunity to be able to scale our impact in really interesting and innovative ways that I think our society is demanding for and requiring right now as well.
That's great. Attack the root cause, right?
That's it.
I have time for one more question, and then we're going to bring it back to the stage.
Great.
Hi, I'm Liz. I am a student and also former nonprofit executive director, actually refunded by Robinhood, so thank you.
Thank you.
And one thing that I struggled with in that role as a small organization was getting philanthropy to support things on a more long-term scale. I know you were talking a lot about that, how like you can get funding in the beginning and then launch something, and then hopefully it becomes self-sustaining. Oh. And hopefully the need goes down, right? So during that middle process where the need is still there, but the initial interest has faded, what advice do you have that organizations can use to kind of keep some of the good stuff going that's working? Because I know I felt personally a lot of pressure to come up with new things when like other things might be working very well.
Yeah. It's a great question, and it is a constant push for organizations, particularly, kind of nascent organizations, young organizations, to kind of constantly keep ahead of this stuff. I think there's a couple key pieces of advice that I would give. One is I think you need to be honest and clear-eyed about the problem that you're trying to solve with the funding community early. It's interesting because when you look at businesses, and every business plan does it, every business plan makes the organization that you're building look like Google, right? No, all I need is a $50,000 influx of cash, and then in 3 years I'll be worth 300 million, and in 7 years I'll be worth 3 billion. And it's like every organization, if you look at their projections, it's like hockey sticks, right? And they feel bad if they don't have a hockey stick, because every organization has a hockey stick. You're like, well, if mine doesn't look like a hockey stick, no one's going to invest in mine. And so there's this constant push that everyone has to make it look like the hockey stick, because that's the only thing that gets the investors interested. Again, I think the work that we're doing, I think we just have to be a little more clear-eyed and sober about it. Every single one of you, you're going to work on hard things. You're going to work on problems that our society has been wrestling with for a very long time. And I think the ability to be able to have that conversation with the organization and be able to manage those expectations early is actually important, and it's crucial. And if you don't have the hockey stick or whatever, it's okay, because you're dealing with people who, frankly, we are in the space and we get it. I think the second piece that I would say is that communication and over-communication is imperative, particularly in early nascent organizations and companies, where we would rather you be proactive in giving us updates about the things that you're seeing, showing us that you're nimble in the way that you're seeing about those things, because when it comes time to have conversations about follow-on funding, when it comes time to talk about what's the other areas of a capital stack that we might look to make some investments in, that type of thing, they become easier conversations when we've had a consistent narrative going. And I think the third thing that I think is important is you bring up something really interesting we constantly feel a need to kind of go into new things and new spaces to keep it interesting. I would actually give you counter advice. I think the biggest danger that new organizations and nascent organizations have is mission creep. Show me that you can solve this initial problem that you're trying to solve. Don't show me that I think I have it figured out, but let me tell you about the 5 other things that I'm going to figure out, because we've read that book before. We've seen that movie before, and we know where this thing is going, where eventually it becomes basically a cash churn and a cash burn. And when we think about what's the problem that's been solved, that question then becomes further and further distant, right? And so I would say, be clear, and this goes back to the diligence question, right? Be clear about the thing that you are trying to solve and solve it. Then once you feel like you got to that point, then we can have conversations about what are the other things that we think we can do and what's the best way of doing it, and is it actually us or is it a partnership, whatever the case might be. But I'm terrified of the new organization that's going to tell me the 6 new ideas that they have in a way to fight poverty. Because what it means is it's telling me, and it's forcing me to ask the question, have you taken your eye off the ball on the initial thing that got us interested in you in the first place? Stay focused. And you don't need to continue giving us a shiny new thing. Just be communicative and tell us why you're on path of being able to accomplish what you're trying to accomplish.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Wes, as we wind down, and like, as you know, half the room are students across the campus.
Yeah.
And I love you have 1 minute that you can give of advice as they're grappling with what next steps they take in making impact on this planet.
Yeah.
What would it be?
So I would actually share with you a very quick story that I think has actually helped to inform me and how I think about not just this work, but kind of my place here on this planet. And so yeah, I will occasionally do various television shows, and one morning I did a show. I'll occasionally go on a show called Morning Joe, which comes on MSNBC in the morning. And when you're a guest on Morning Joe, you're never sure who the other guests are going to be, because they have their hosts, but then they bring on guests every day and it changes all the time. And so the only thing you can do is just go on the show and kind of like hope for the best, that there's some interesting people you're gonna be sitting with. And I remember going there and seeing the chart, the list of who's gonna be the guest. And I saw that one of the people that was gonna be a guest in the 8 o'clock hour was a gentleman named Harry Belafonte. Mm. And Harry Belafonte was a king in my house coming up. And for those who don't know Harry Belafonte, he was a singer, actor, activist, original sex symbol. I say my grandmother loves some Harry Belafonte. Say I always think to myself, if you've never sat in a seat to hear your grandmother talk incessantly about someone's tight pants, it's a very uncomfortable seat to sit in. But my family really loved Harry Belafonte, and it wasn't just because he has a beautiful voice. It's because he had a beautiful voice. It's because he made his voice mean something. It's because it's difficult to understand the civil rights movement without understanding the role that Harry Belafonte played. It's difficult to understand the anti-war movements without understanding the role that Harry Belafonte played. Difficult to understand the anti-apartheid movement without understanding the role that Harry Belafonte played. Difficult to understand Black Lives Matter without understanding the role that Harry Belafonte played. Harry Belafonte has played a crucial role in many movements over the past 50 years, and he did it knowing every time he opened his mouth, he was taking a risk. He did it knowing every single time he opened his mouth, a new FBI file was being opened up on him. And he did it anyway. And so when he came to the set, he sat down, and people were, and he's a legend. So people were asking him a whole bunch of different questions about his activism and asking questions about his performances and kind of his life and kind of in sum. And when it came time for me to ask a question about it, I really wanted to dig into I really wanted to do a follow-on, and so the activism questions he was being asked. And I said, there's some people when they hit a certain level of celebrity, or they hit a certain level of accomplishment, or notoriety, or privilege, or whatever, they get real quiet. And they get real quiet because they somehow feel if they say anything about anything, it might hurt them. So they say nothing. And they let the world continue to turn with their fingerprints being nowhere on it. And Mr. Belafonte never did that. And so I asked Mr. Belafonte, why did he always feel a need to say something even when he didn't have to? And he gave what I thought was such a brilliant, brilliant answer. He looked at me and he smiled. And he said, Because it's more fun to live that way. And he said, some people wake up in the morning and they call their accountants. I wake up in the morning and I call Nelson Mandela. Who do you think has a more interesting life? And he said it, and I'll wrap this up, but he said it in such a beautiful, beautiful way, and in a way I'll never forget, because basically what he was saying was that if you're not going to do it to be selfless, then do it to be selfish. Because if you really want to live in a place and in a society where you feel like the future and the hopes and the dreams of your children and grandchildren are going to be protected, you would better make sure that everybody in that society feels the exact same way. And if you really want to live in a society where you can actually accomplish more tomorrow than you accomplished today, and you feel like the society and that society will root for you in that accomplishment, you would better make sure that everybody feels the exact same way. All of you are going to have to make some really hard decisions. All of you are going to have to do things that are going to feel uncomfortable. All of you are going to ask to use your voice in really new and creative ways. None of you will ever make a decision that you will get 100% of the people who think it's a good decision. If you are making decisions that 100% of the people think are good decisions, you're not making real decisions. You're not. You are going to make decisions that you have to walk in there knowing, if I get 60%, that's a great day. And tomorrow I'll wake up and make another decision. But do it with a way and with a focus and with a belief that the decisions that you are making and the choices that you are making of when to use your voice, that they are being led by something deep, that they're being led by a commitment to the work, that they're being led by a commitment to justice, that they're being led by a commitment to progress. Because if that becomes the thing, if that becomes your North Star, if that becomes the thing that you're going to make your decisions on, even if everybody's not there, it's a decision that you can sleep comfortably with. And so the thing that I ask for all of you is, I guess, in the words of Mr. Belafonte, I want you to go out there and live really interesting lives. I want you to push and challenge and not be worried about being the most popular. I want you to advocate and push and knowing that not everyone's going to love everything you do. But as long as you're doing it for the right reasons, and as long as you're always willing to fight for the right people, then you know that you've lived a life well lived. And that's all that should matter.